Well, good afternoon and welcome to this ODI seminar on development finance institutions and the pandemic response, supporting job protection during and after the pandemic. We are organizing this meeting in partnership with the CDC, the UK's Development Finance Institution, DEG, the German equivalent, Proparco, and the EDFI, European Development Finance Institutions more generally. This event is the first in a broader series that we're organizing, exploring how development finance institutions have responded to the COVID-19 crisis. The next event will be on support for the health sector, for example, which will take place on the 22nd of October. This meeting is about development finance institutions and jobs. And there are sort of a large number of jobs that have already been lost globally due to the pandemic, and some are expected to be lost even further. There are also quite a large number of people in vulnerable employment, and that is also expected to increase dramatically. Now, it's also fair to say that there have been formidable policy responses already. But I would also say that perhaps they're not enough, and certainly with respect to low-income countries. If we, for example, look at support measures for the private sector, a forthcoming World Bank paper suggests that only 4.5% of firms in low-income countries can access such measures, and this is rising to about 40% in high-income country settings. So this presents an opportunity for development finance institutions to play a crucial role in this pandemic and also in the future to strengthen firms through their strategic, practical, and financial means. In the short run, it's to protect jobs and the quality of jobs, and to support the private sector. Perhaps in the medium term as well, who need to pull the recovery onto sort of a better and a more diversified growth path, which involves formalization, responding to digitalization, etc. And this is sort of for the medium and the longer term, a key opportunity for DFIs. And so I'm very pleased that to discuss this, we have a really excellent panel with sort of the right expertise. I'll be asking them in a minute to make an initial statement for about 5 minutes each. And we'll then discuss questions from the audience that come in through the chat. And I'm really delighted that we have such a large audience today. And then I'll be closing the meeting at about 2 p.m. after I've had given the chance to the presenters to say some final remarks. So let me briefly introduce the panel. We have 4 panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Stephen Karingi. He's the Director for Regional Integration and the Trade Division of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and he joined that in 2004. Secondly, we have Professor Carlos Oya. He's a Professor of Political Economy of Development at SOAS here in London, and he's recently undertaken highly influential research on industrial workforces in, for example, Ethiopia, garment value chains, and also the role of Chinese labor practices in Africa. And then we'll turn to 2 DFI specialists, specialists on labor quality. For example, we'll hear from Dr. Sam Lacey, who is CDC's job quality lead, shaping the organization's approach to SDG 8 and the decent work agenda. And she has 15 years of professional experience in responsible investment and business. And then we'll turn finally to Dr. Julian Frede, who is a senior manager at the DEG's Department for Corporate Strategy and Development Policy. And Julian is, amongst others, responsible for the development and implementation of DEG's impact management system, and also a range of strategic evaluation studies. So let me first turn to Stephen, Dr. Stephen Karingi. Given the large impact on African economies that we currently seeing during the COVID crisis, and particularly the impact on the negative impact on private sector jobs on the continent, what do you think should be the policy responses, and what do you think is an appropriate role for development finance institutions? Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying that we expect the COVID-19 pandemic to have a very severe negative impact on employment in Africa. And the fear is that it's likely to reverse years of gains that the continent has been making. So before I give you my thinking on, or at least our ideas on how the DFIs could come in, allow me to give you a few statistics. Now, the first statistic I would want to share with you is that because of COVID-19, it is expected that there was going to be a 10% increase in employment vulnerability in the continent. And based on that, we have undertaken at the Economic Commission for Africa, 99 million are going to be pushed back into extreme poverty. It is interesting that there was an article today in the Financial Times where they were talking of how difficult it is for families to get out of poverty once they are pushed back in extreme poverty. Now, the second point I would want to make is that we did a survey between June and July in collaboration with the International Economic Consultants, a firm that is based in Mauritius. And what we did was to find out what the businesses see as the prospects for jobs going forward. What we found is and this is in addition to the start by these businesses when the pandemic started. The other point I would want to make is that those businesses that are working in the area of goods, because we asked them whether they are working in the area of goods or in the area of services, those businesses that are working in the area of goods, they are likely to lay off more employees than those that are working in services. So, what are the possible reasons behind these job losses by these businesses within the continent? They gave us the three top challenges that they are facing. These three challenges include the reduction of opportunities for them to meet in demand of their products and their services, and thirdly, and very importantly, for the conversation we are having here, lack of operational cash. Cash flow challenges have been the issue for
Stephen, I think we have a bit difficulties hearing you. Maybe what we can do is, if you try and work on your connection, then what we can then do is first move to Carlos Oya, and then maybe you can work on your connection in the meantime, so we can improve it, and then we can follow you. Otherwise, it's a bit difficult to hear you, and I'm sorry to the audience that we find it difficult for the connection is, I think, from Kenya. But let's move then first to Carlos, and I mean, Stephen already started with some statistics, but and also sort of about the number of jobs that are being lost, and it's important to think about the protection of jobs and quality workforce, and protecting jobs is a crucial issue during the crisis. But there are also longer term issues, as I mentioned, such as diversification and the future of work considerations. What do you think are the key policy issues, the labour market issues that need to be considered? And what is the potential role for private sector DFIs in this? So please, over to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you for inviting me to this excellent panel and very exciting topic, even if it's one that is not, that is sometimes a little bit depressing to talk about. But I mean, I want to make a number of points in terms of the key policy issues and challenges in relation to the very short term, and then in relation to the medium to the long term. But before that, just a quick premise. in relation to what we're really talking about. And I'm basically thinking particularly about low-income countries or low-middle-income countries where these problems are exacerbated by the fact that labor market conditions generate a very, very high proportion of what the ILO calls vulnerable employment, which by definition is vulnerable, highly vulnerable to precisely these kind of shocks like COVID-19. And that is the reality of most countries, and also the reality of most of these countries is that there are no established and widespread social protection systems to cope with such shocks. They are not functioning social insurance systems, unemployment benefit systems, etc., which means that when people lose jobs, or when people in some cases, not so much losing a job, but being able to work fewer days or getting less for what they work, there is no way of getting income as an alternative. So job protection is a hugely important issue, and one has to think creatively about what kinds of things can improve. I think when we talk about improving the quality jobs, there are many issues that are frequently mentioned, particularly in the decent work agenda. But I would especially highlight for low and middle income countries, there are two attributes that are fundamental importance for workers. But when you talk to workers, these are the two things that always stand out. One is decent remuneration, and this relates to the idea of a living wage, on which there is no consensus. How do you calculate a living wage? But there are options there. And secondly is job security. A stable job that doesn't always depend on demand conditions or other constraints, which often affect, for example, informal and vulnerable jobs. So these two characteristics, for example, tend to come with formalized jobs, or jobs that are an outcome of processes of structural change, structural transformation. So in countries like Ethiopia, that is embarking into a very ambitious process of industrialization, precisely one of the goals is to build up the pool of more stable industrial jobs, which will benefit particularly young women. So again, the question is, how much we can sustain the expansion of these kinds of jobs, and what can we do to protect these emerging jobs from shocks like COVID. So I see two basic areas of intervention and thinking and areas of challenges. The first one is the short term, and we already know a little bit of what's happened since March and some of the affected countries. So in the short term, the emphasis really is, and the need tends to be on cushioning the shock and basically engaging in damage limitation. So for policymakers and firms, the issue remains, how can we keep as many jobs as possible? How can we keep as much work time as possible for those who have fractional, flexible jobs, or depend on the hours, the days they work? And then third, obviously, the finding alternative sources of income if those jobs are no longer viable in the context of shocks like COVID. So that means retooling livelihoods. So a key instrument for the first two objectives is, what we know as furlough or, other wage subsidy schemes. Now, the big question for low and middle income countries is affordability. Where there is no fiscal space, what can you do to finance these kinds of interventions, these wage subsidy schemes? A blanket furlough scheme, for example, may be quite effective and provide a counter shock in the very short term, but it turns out to be very expensive and not sustainable over a long period of time. However, there are other more flexible schemes, such as the German Kurzarbeit. I don't know if I pronounce it well, the short work, which seems to be working slightly better in terms of smoothing out the impact on jobs and public finances. So the question is, can these schemes be applied to low and middle income countries where there's no fiscal space for this? That is a big question mark, and this is perhaps something that we can discuss. But this is something that is, as a mechanism of protection, is absolutely fundamental. One problem, for example, that arose in Ethiopia was, and that's why wage subsidy schemes were long discussed and eventually not implemented, is there's not enough resources, but also that if you target particular populations, for example, the industrial workers in industrial parks. And the question is, what about the rest? And if the others are not affected or not eligible for a wage subsidy scheme, that can raise serious political questions. So there is a question of political feasibility in some of these job protection schemes that needs to be taken seriously. Now, moving forward, what can we say at the medium to long term? Here, the key challenge for me is building resilience in production networks. So jobs are not so vulnerable to shocks like COVID-19. And for example, when you look at the global value chains like apparel, COVID-19 has indeed revealed the structural vulnerabilities of these production networks and the lack of resilience. So something needs to be done because, we're talking about hundreds and not thousands of suppliers in Asia and Africa that have been suspending operations or shutting down. So I can see here two areas two policy issues mainly. One is what can be done within global value chains, what kinds of changes and improvements can be achieved within a global value chain in order to build resilience. And secondly, what can be done more in terms of economy-wide actions in order to smooth out the impact of these shocks on jobs. Within global value chains, there's different things. For example, in the case of apparel, global production networks, I believe that improving the governance of these networks and building verticality can indeed contribute to strengthening the links between lead firms, buyers, the suppliers, the workers, and of course, governments. So if this is achieved, one would expect greater accountability, especially of lead firms, and through that, building trust and commitment to resilience. Secondly, one example of this would be expanding global framework agreements like the ones that companies like Inditex or H&M have, which can be designed to improve job security with strong commitment from lead firms to create job protection systems within those chains. There are many other things that can be done, such as building up stocks to avoid disruption in supply chains when raw materials and inputs are not accessible for a period of time, or any other trade facilitation measures that can help avoid or reduce supply chain disruption. In terms of outside the global value chains and more in terms of economy-wide actions, it's quite clear that in order to address these risks, there's a need to diversify and avoid dependence on global value chains or sectors that are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 type of shocks. So it is okay for Ethiopia to specialize in apparel, but it might be advisable also to expand the range of products, i.e., for example, to PPE or manufacturing sectors, pharmaceuticals, agricultural inputs, and so on and so forth, because the level of vulnerability is likely to vary in relation to these shocks. And then, for example, if you look at services, we know that services are particularly vulnerable to shocks like COVID. So it is important that service providers build resilience by being able to quickly adjust to a new situation, such as a lockdown. So, for example, by having, say, home delivery or online delivery as fallback options. So that requires investments, that requires finance that is not always readily available. So let me just end my intervention with an idea about why DFIs can play a very, very important role in these. I think the most obvious is providing finance to expand fiscal space. Fiscal space is necessary in low and middle income countries in order to basically build up these job protection and more generally social protection systems. And secondly, I think it's possible that DFIs can use the advantage they have in terms of being able to coordinate multi-country responses always backed up by finance. I think this is one of the big lessons from COVID-19, the first few months of the pandemic, is the absolute imperative necessity of improving coordination and engaging in multi-country responses to the pandemic, which hasn't really happened as we would have wished. So I'm going to stop there, Dirk.
Okay, thank you very much. So, very important role for DFIs in for job protection schemes and also in building resilience in value chains, for example. Let me just return to Stephen, if that is all right, and maybe you could proceed with your remarks. Sorry that we lost you briefly. We make up some time, but if you could make your remarks, Stephen.
Oh, thank you, Doug, and sorry about that mishap. Now, I think the other panelists may have already mentioned some of the things that I would have said. So let me go straight to the issue of the role of the DFIs. And I would like, first of all, to start by saying that based on the survey that we did, the banks and the other financial institutions, based on the responses we got, they seem not to be playing the strong countercyclical role that is expected of them. And that is why the DFIs are critical here, because they have a very unique opportunity to play a role in terms of supporting the firms that are facing the liquidity issues now, and also protecting the private sector jobs. Now, earlier in this pandemic, there is a piece of work that the ECA and ODI did, and there is a piece that was published between Dirk, myself, and the Executive Secretary of ECA. And essentially in that piece, basically what we said was that the DFIs can do very well to support the private sector in the continent if they do three things. One, by fast-tracking the responses when the private sector comes to them, because we have seen that the private sector in the continent is not getting as much and as rapid response as it would require. Two, they can actually have a moratorium on the repayments for the ongoing businesses. And three, they can come up with a bouncing back better facility, because the future is such that you need to save the jobs. So those are three things that we said last time. Now, these actions are both good, and they're also good for business. So would want to encourage the DFIs to help the existing portfolio of companies. That is the first thing, but also for them to come in, because as you recover, as these private sector firms in Africa recover out of the pandemic, it becomes good business also for the DFIs. Now, there are some examples of where now the DFIs can actually invest in. And I would want to give very quickly three examples based on what we have seen happening in the continent. The first area that the DFIs can actually do is actually to support those private sector firms, especially the manufacturing firms that have demonstrated the capacity to repurpose and also to retool for them to be able to provide the essential medical supplies. So beyond the pandemic, we can actually create a resilience for the continent. And this is where the DFIs can actually come in and support these kind of private sector firms. The second one is actually strengthening logistics. There are companies that are actually preparing themselves to take advantage, or at least to play a role when it comes to the vaccine distribution. So the DFIs can invest in African companies that are already playing, putting together the ground to be part and parcel of the distribution of the vaccines when that happens. And lastly, we have seen that Africa has actually been able to at least mitigate the impacts of the pandemic through the digitalization. Quite a number of African countries have come up with solutions, and it would be good for the DFIs to invest in these kind of companies, also help them to scale up. That will not only be good for these companies, but also for the other companies that they provide services to. So this is what I wanted to say, that the DFIs can actually have a very important role to play in protecting livelihoods and also jumpstarting economic recovery, but at the same time, supporting companies that are going to be there for the long haul. Thank you very much.
Well, that was really loud and clear, Stephen. I think some very good and specific demands from the DFIs, basically, or for the DFIs, and to help the response and the recovery, and which is, I think, a very good opportunity for DFIs. And so I think we should also now turn to DFI representatives, and let's first turn to Dr. Sam Lacey. So we're very interested to hear from you how CDC helps to protect jobs and improve job quality in its investee companies, of course, and particularly with regard to informal work and vulnerable populations. Maybe you could, well, the floor is yours for about 5 minutes, Sam.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and also particularly thank you to Stephen, because although I had no prior warning of the points that he was going to make, it actually feeds in nicely to a number of the points I wanted to make. So that's lucky. There seems to be some kind of alignment there. I think the first thing I wanted to say was that I want to be really clear that even before COVID hit, there was an enormous jobs crisis in the markets in which DFIs invest. For example, in India, over 80% of people who are in work in the informal sector. In Africa, less than 15% of people who are working are actually in the formal sector. So in a sense, those who have the formal jobs are the lucky ones. And in Africa in particular, that's due to get worse, irrespective of COVID, simply because of the youth bulge and the need for 18 million new jobs per year to be created to meet that growing working age population. Clearly, this has been exacerbated by COVID, and the ILO estimated that between March and June of this year, the number of working hours globally reduced by 14%, which is the equivalent of 400 million full-time jobs. And that impact is much worse in developing countries, and it's much worse even within developing countries for the most vulnerable, such as women and youth. So what's the role of DFIs in all of this? I agree with all the points that Stephen made. I think the reason that DFIs exist, or a huge part of DFIs mandates, even pre-COVID, was to create and support livelihoods. And a huge part of that is through formal job creation and the protection of formal jobs, and ensuring the quality of those jobs. A less celebrated part of our mandate is also to improve livelihoods in the informal sector, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's just pause on the formal job creation and protection piece for a moment. CDC has taken a 3-pillar approach to its COVID response, and actually, just before I go into that, I just wanted to say, in response to Stephen's point about needing to react quickly, a little insight into what it was like within CDC as COVID hit. And I think, the first week when we all suddenly went into lockdown, everyone is suddenly working from home, trying to figure out how to work from home. And then, sort of a day or two after that, you suddenly realize what the impact is going to be in our markets, and that this is the time to step up. And I think as an employee in a DFI at that time, everybody put their shoulder to the wheel. It was really incredible how, from the bottom up, from all across the different teams in CDC, everyone said, what can I do? What can I do for my companies? Which of my companies are most vulnerable? Which of my companies could adapt to be part of the solution? And there was really a kind of bottom up response from across the business of people saying, okay, I've got my own stuff to deal with. I'm now at home with my children and I'm trying to deal with that. But everyone was also thinking about the portfolio, and that was really inspiring. So I just wanted to share that briefly. So the first pillar of our 3-pronged approach was to preserve the over 800,000 jobs in the over 1,200 companies in which we invest. And I'll come back to how we preserve those jobs in a second. The second pillar is to strengthen businesses and help them adapt to be part of the response. And that's something that I think Stephen spoke about. So, for example, picking up on Stephen's example, delivery companies that previously delivered consumer goods adapted to delivering food and medical supplies. Manufacturers that previously, again, developed consumer goods or clothes adapted to PPE or ventilators. A pharmaceutical distribution company sourced large numbers of COVID testing kits and partnered up with a bank to provide small pharmacies with the credit facilities to enable them to buy those testing kits. So there was a huge amount of that kind of activity, as well as the core preserving the existing jobs. And we had a suite of tools at our disposal to do that. So we have our investment capital, so we could invest more in businesses that needed to scale up or adapt. And I think also, as Stephen mentioned, we were able to consider how we could be flexible about the terms of our legal agreements, and particularly loan agreements around, when they're due to be repaid and so on and so forth. We also have a technical assistance facility, which includes some grant capital, which could be used to help companies access the advice that they needed to pivot their business models and adapt to the crisis, or even just adapt their employment models, adapt to working from home. There was a huge amount of change that companies had to go through very, very quickly. So we were able to help with that. And we also kind of absorbed some of those lessons and started producing advisory notes, hosting webinars, and helping individual companies with bespoke support. And then the third pillar, which is the one that I want to spend a moment on, although I'm aware I'm running out of time, is the rebuild pillar, which is all about thinking about where are the formal jobs going to be created at scale in our markets, investing to support the creation of formal jobs in new sectors, in emerging sectors, in business process outsourcing, in sectors that are growing due to digitization. But we need to recognize that formal jobs are not going to scale quickly enough. If you think back to the statistics that I gave at the beginning about less than 15% of jobs in Africa are in the formal sector, we're not overnight going to be able to switch that to 90%. So we also need to look at how we support the improvement of livelihoods in the informal sector. And I think, certainly in my memory, the images of the informal workers in India, the internal migrants walking home when their jobs were stopped at a moment's notice when lockdown hit, really brought that vulnerability that they live with every day to the world's attention. And so I really think that there is DFIs already play a role in supporting the improvement of informal livelihoods through the loans and the financial services that we provide to small-scale entrepreneurs, through the formal businesses that we invest in that outsource to the informal sector, and the work that we do to improve the quality of the jobs in the contractors and subcontractors that we outsource to. But we also have a growing role, I think, to think about how we can support informal jobs through the growing digitized trading platforms and labor platforms. And how can we use those platforms that are serving to kind of organize the informal sector as an opportunity to direct support to those informal workers to develop their businesses, whether that's through providing them access to loans, providing them access to training, providing them access to resources that help them to develop their businesses in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. I'm aware I've spoken for more than my 5 minutes, so I'll leave it there, but would love to come back to that theme in the discussion if people are interested. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sam. So very clear as well, the response from CDC: preserve, strengthen, and rebuild. And you're saying that you're already supporting a range of activities. In that sense, DFIs are already building back better. They were already doing that actually before the crisis, and they're just doing that now again. But you also said there might be a growing role and an improved role and a beefed up role, as it were, to this. So we can explore that as well. So thank you very much indeed. So I think we should now turn to Dr. Julian Freder and to hear from him, how does DG help to protect jobs and improve job quality in its investee companies, and has it changed DG's approach to job quality? And if we're aiming to build back better after this shock, what should better look like in your view? Over to you.
Thanks, Dirk, and thanks to all the speakers, especially Sam. I can only, I think, add what what she was speaking about. And thanks really for showing the situation that you had at CDC. And I can definitely mirror that from DEG, that partly people just said, I could sleep quite well tonight because my job is safe and my kids are at home. But my clients have problems, and the situations out there is really troublesome, and they work day and night to support that. In general, I wanted to make 3 points, as you have also split your question. So job quality and how DFIs are kind of related to supporting jobs and formal jobs. I think one thing is that a DFI has not directly the idea to create jobs per se, but via business growth, sustainable business growth to support business success, and via this long-term success also to provide a good basis for a sustainable job. So we are not per se job creators, it would be like job programs, but we support long-term financially viable jobs in the business activities. Decency is a totally different thing. Decency, job quality is a major aspect of DFI's works, and it was formerly more on risk management, so that job quality was part of keeping ILO core labor standards, no child labor, and so on. But it's more moved, and since 5 years, it's also in DEG's target system to say we need to go beyond compliance and also go on a HR system focus, and on top on the upside focus, so closing skills gap, employee motivation, career path planning, and so on. So there's a direct link of economic success and social inclusion here. And that is something DFIs are very active since, as I said, on the risk side since ages, and on this impact focus at DEG, I'd say since 4 years, we have it included in our target system. Now, in times of crisis, I think there are, again, 2 sides. On the one side, it's we keep businesses alive. So the supporting economic sustainability from this triangle, economic sustainability and being a partner in times of crisis is a major element of the DFI's mission. And I think it became clear again in this crisis. And yes, it's difficult for DFI to select now the ones where you say there's a liquidity crisis or there's a solvency crisis. So which clients can we support with quick liquidity so that they are kept alive in these times? On the other side now, we also saw beyond economic aspects in our Corona task force, beside financials, it's ESG management. So how is the client managing his environmental and social and corporate governance aspects? And normally they then got a quicker access to liquidity, for example, if we knew systems are well equipped. And then job protection was part of it. When you see job protection, there are 2 aspects. We targeted with specific technical assistances, so kind of the quick crisis responses. Quick crisis responses were on one side health, so protect the job, the staff against COVID-19. These were like health support, hygiene concepts and everything like this. So getting consultants and consultancy guidances to the clients, even on the ground, to support them building up hygiene concept in the facilities to protect the people and keep business going. And on the other side, we had HR and labor risks support, as we saw clients which have even retrenchments, quick retrenchments done, because we found out that it's often not linked to their financial planning. I give one example. We had a client with shops all over a country, and the first thing what they found out is, oh, crisis cut sales by 50%. Let's get rid of costs. Yeah, and they threw out actually a lot of contracted work, so the more vulnerable workers, as like kind of switching off a machine. And now 2-3 months later, they just said, okay, let's restart. And then they were surprised that you cannot just switch on again labor force, because they will not come back immediately if they don't have to. And a lot of them just said, okay, you left us in a second, we will not come back to you. So they really have a trouble now bringing back sales because they dealt in a way economically or business technically not correct with their workforce. So again, it's like make retrenchment better, or even don't lose your workforce, go into deals with them on, I don't know, free leave and so on, keep them to your company is a business case. And at the same time, it's a good activity for social sustainability. Coming to these building back better aspects, at DEG, we are still quite clear about that we need also in future to do our homework. So pushing companies contractually, but also supporting them if they are interested to be compliant with international labor standards, and also showing them in future even easier now the business case of environmental, social, especially the social aspect of management. That's a core aspect of DG's business. Was it before? And I think with the crisis and discussing resilience, it's even more relevant. Corporate governance for us is now also taking this aspect of managing jobs and HR management pretty serious, because crisis revealed that often HR management, HR planning is not directly linked to financial planning. So if clients now came to us saying, oh, we need to cut costs and we will probably do retrenchment plans, we just said, okay, show us the financial planning and how your retrenchment payments are included into it. And often they weren't. So there's a corporate governance issue to this, where we think there could be a new standard set, which is a business case, and on the other side also very much pushing social sustainability. Two other points that I wanted to bring. What studies also show is that the most vulnerable is not only the vulnerable populations, but also the smaller the business, the harder they are hit. They're more dependent on monthly income, and so they are. So what we as DG still want to continue strongly to do institution building with financial institutions, to reach out to the SMEs, to microfinance, also small growing corporates, yeah, to build a certain business base and support them long term, reaching informal sectors. And the other one is we want to strengthen our environmental social management to the value chains. Digital solutions are helping us very much to now cover more than direct and first link employees, which are working in the value chain, but we can go up to the crop that is grown. And that is something we also want to enforce. I think that were the major points on building back better, and I think we can start discussion.
Okay, Julian, thank you very much. And so now I'd like to open it up to the wider audience. And I've already seen that some questions have come through the chat, which is very helpful. What I'll be doing is taking some of these questions and putting them to the panel. So I first have 2 to 3 questions to, and I put them to Julian and Sam, and bringing a couple of strands together as well. First, a question from Charles Weston. He was asking, were DFIs actually prepared well enough for the labor market impacts of a crisis like COVID-19? Scientists seem to be suggesting pandemics could become much more frequent. Do we now need a new approach to this one? It also ties into sort of building resilience point that Carlos Aya was mentioning. And so that is quite an important question. And I think it also ties in a bit with Julian, what you were saying at the end. And then there's a question also, I think, which is relevant for DFI representatives on the panel, which is an anonymous question. And it's suggesting that there are quite a few development finance institutions. And the question is anyone trying to coordinate the job protection responses to the pandemic? Or is each DFI following its own agenda? Of course, we've heard both of your institution, DG, CDC, saying on day 2, immediately being worried about what they can do. Is there also, maybe on day 3, has there been sort of a discussion taking place between the DFIs, and perhaps you can discuss a bit on sort of the collaboration, because I think it's so important to collaborate, because the scale of the crisis is so huge. It's bigger, much bigger than the global financial crisis, and it's really important that DFIs also have a counter-cyclical response and can be working together. So maybe Sam, maybe you would have a brief response to these questions, and then Julian.
Thank you very much. No, they're both very good questions. I think, were we prepared well enough? I mean, it's a fair question. Can anyone ever be prepared well enough for something like that has hit on a scale really never before seen? I think what we did find was that the tools we already had at our disposal were very useful. So we were able to use our investment capital. We were able to flex terms on legal agreements. We were able to use our technical assistance facilities and our internal teams that have strong relationships with investees to advise them and support them. So I think the tools we had at our disposal proved quite useful for the task. But of course, you can always be better prepared. And I think looking forward, if we're thinking that these kinds of crises may become more frequent, and let's be clear, we're not only talking about pandemic crises, we're talking about climate crises and all sorts of other crises that may hit us in the future, then this concept of resilience, and resilience at the individual level, how can we help build resilience for those vulnerable workers who at a moment's notice are let go and they have no social security, they have no savings, they have, in some cases, like in India, not even a way to get home. How can you build resilience at the person, at the worker level, and then how can you build resilience at the system level? And that, I think, is something that is probably beyond the scope of this call to really figure out how that happens. But that is an area that, as DFIs, as investors, as academics, we all need to put our minds together on. To the other question, which was around coordination, yes, there's been a huge amount of coordination. I think, again, we already had forums in which the sort of larger multilateral development banks meet together to talk about things they're working on, and the sort of smaller bilateral, like the European DFIs, like DEG, Proparco, and others, and ourselves. And then we also coordinate between the two, because I think the tools at our disposal are slightly different for the bilaterals compared to the multilaterals that have stronger relationships with government. And we are coordinating, but we also all have unique roles in relation to our particular portfolios. So whilst we do, of course, need to coordinate and to compare and learn from one another, when it comes down to how you help an individual company, only you can do that because you have that relationship, particularly for the bilaterals that don't really have a direct relationship with government. I don't know, Julian, whether you want to add any more.
Yeah, I think on coordination, I'd like to add that I was really surprised how fast our CEO was involved in weekly calls with other DFIs, CEOs, really talking about, okay, how can we coordinate? How can we improve? Where are you going? Are you going to support a certain fund? Are you going to support certain regions? What is done best by your institution? How can we learn? And that was really like an open discussion they made. And I was really surprised on which level and how fast that started going, and the frequency they did this. Yeah. So for me, that was in a way a surprise, because before coordination was also done, but that you kind of see there's a big problem, a crisis hitting your institution, and probably not the first, but the second thing is you take the phone and call your friends. That was quite a good feeling to see that coordination before already was working quite well. Yeah, and I involved there also IFC and the European DFIs, not only Europe. So I was really impressed by this. And then on the other side, what we do when we talk on the Corona task force about supporting a client, we check not only the client has a financial crisis, is he going to retrench jobs, how is his ESG management, but we also check who else is involved. And then we just, the investment managers know each other. So on a single client, on a single investment, they call each other saying, hey, are you planning a technical assistance with them? What are your funds? What do you think with liquidity? Should we do a virtual due diligence together? So these talks were coordinated on the single client basis. So I was actually surprised being able to see the both sides, how CEOs checked what's going on and how can we improve. And then even on the ground, we checked, there's already CDC with this client, let's go for another one. Yeah, so I like that approach quite well. And yes, there is, if you say coordination, of the development finance institution, it's kind of a voluntary coordination, but it went like private sector activities. It went quite well from my view up to now. With regard to be prepared, yes, we can prepare it better. Yeah, and I think now after this crisis, everybody will be prepared a bit better. But you just have to keep a certain flexibility, and our work continues to be flexible. So I think the more flexible we are working in future, the better prepared we will be for any crisis which we cannot foresee.
Okay, thank you. So there are some other questions, and there's a question from Adam Bradford, and I'd like to put them to Carlos and Stephen, and they may also want to respond to what they've heard just now. But there's one about, I think, scale of the firms that are being supported. So is there a role for micro impact entrepreneurship in providing work with low barrier to entry for some people? And perhaps that may you may want to think about sort of a wider question around the sort of formal versus informal sector. How do you reach the informal sector? And I was mentioning that in my introduction, only 4.5% of the firms that are operating in low-income country settings have had access to external support. And so it's very difficult to reach a lot of firms in low-income country settings. And so what is the role of scale in this? Are large firms important? Are small firms important? What is the role for each? Maybe Carlos, you want to go first, and then Stephen. You may also want to respond to some of the other points that are being raised.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is obviously a very difficult question, and the problem is that answering this question is understanding whether we're talking about the short term, the medium term, or the long run. If you ask me in the long run, it is quite clear that an economy cannot develop on the basis of millions of atomized micro-entrepreneurs. I don't know a single example in history where that has happened. So it is unquestionable that in one way or another, economies, in order to diversify it and structurally transform, will have to gradually create bigger business. You know, then the large firms need to emerge out of this process of transformation. Now, the problem is what happens in the short term, where the evidence of these, you know, huge informal sectors and atomized micro-entrepreneurs, etc., is precisely a symptom of those other businesses, larger businesses, not developing, and the symptom of there not being a social protection system. So people cannot afford to be unemployed, therefore they will do anything they can in order to survive, and self-employment and micro-entrepreneurship is an answer to that. So I would be wary of seeing the promotion of micro-entrepreneurship as a way out in relation to building resilience. I think there is something that can be done for those who are in a way stuck in that kind of situation, and that requires particular types of intervention. I don't think that microfinance is necessarily the answer. I mean, there's other social protection mechanisms that may be more important, more relevant for these kind of situation. And then there's a question of how DFIs and others can really coordinate and contribute to the emergence of a more viable business, and that is really always my worry. Yeah.
Stephen?
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to start by saying that the African continent today is creating a platform that is going to respond to the points that were raised by Carlos. In other words, we have this one market that is being created, the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is going to be a playing field for scaling up of these MSMEs and SMEs, so to speak. So they'll have an opportunity to grow beyond their national markets. And I think this brings me back to the point I was saying. If the DFIs can invest in these small farms in Africa now, going forward, it's going to become very good business, because now we are going to remove all these tariffs and tariff barriers, and we are going to have a functional regional integration within the continent, because issues of competition policy, intellectual property, investment, digitalization are going to be taken care of. Now, in order to, before I conclude, you raised the issue of the informal sector, and really, if there is one sector that has suffered out of this pandemic, is the informal sector, because they become non-existent because you don't know where they are. So if somebody had a small business, it was informal, it was not registered. Even if the government wanted to help, it was not able to help. So that's why, again, the response, taking advantage of the lessons of digitalization, it becomes very important, because it's going to help us see these informal sector companies as they become visible through technology. I don't know whether you're going to give me my last 1 minute, or we are going to come back in another round, because I was going to say the following. In the survey that we did, we asked these firms, what would you want the government to do for you? They said they would want to see a postponement of tax payments, provision of working capital, access to low interest loans. Unfortunately, the African governments are so constrained from the fiscal point of view. Again, this shows why the DFIs are so critical in at least sustaining the current businesses and also growing sustainable businesses within the continent. Remembering that it's good business because we have the African Continental Free Trade Area that is just going to become operational from 1st of January 2021 in terms of startup.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. That's very helpful. And also thank you for reminding that we need to be close to 2 p.m. What I'd like to do is just read down one question that has come in as well, which I think is perhaps also important. But then I will give everyone 1 minute final response. So you may not be able to answer this particular question, but a question that came in from Sam Attridge, which is that in the long term, building back or rebuilding and creating jobs at scale requires coordination between DFIs. And you've touched on that, and you gave some examples there, but also with local actors and governments as well. And Carlos mentioned the need to diversify and transform economies, and this requires coordinated action and alignment with country plans. And then she said she hasn't come across many DFIs that have sort of country strategies that look strategically about market development and transformation. And perhaps you could comment on this. I don't know whether you want to take this, but I suppose in the final point, the final minute that you've got, maybe you can also think a bit about, so what is the one opportunity that is there for DFIs to think about job protection during the crisis now? And what is sort of the one thing you think DFIs now need to be looking at? And maybe I should do it in reverse order. Maybe I take Julian first, and then Sam, and then Carlos, and then Stephen. So Julian, maybe you'd like to go first.
I think final statement on this talks is that DFIs need to do their homework first. I think that is something we have done before the crisis. Now in the crisis, we moved up on that. And now we kind of have to take it really serious to go on the compliance, take in the more vulnerable, informal people, thinking about the value chains and taking digital solutions into that. So making that homework first and then thinking about building back better and nice extra things, but really going on this issue and really supporting formal jobs in our partner countries.
I like that. We need to do more homework. Sam.
Yeah, fully support what Julian said. I think it's really important, particularly at times like this, but at any time for DFIs to take a step back and look at where our resources can best be used to support livelihoods at scale and the improvement of livelihoods at scale. And I think, as Carlos said, part of that is about growing the formal sector. But the piece that is different this time to any other country that has developed before now is the role that digitization is playing and the role that digital platforms are playing. Now, there's a huge amount of risk and opportunity in that role. On the risk side, you've got the risk that by semi-formalizing a huge informal sector, you enable a formal business to take advantage of the lack of regulations and lack of protections for the workers sitting underneath that platform. On the flip side, if you're an investor with a development mandate, those kinds of platforms, if managed responsibly, give you access to that informal sector that you would never otherwise get. So if you pick your partners wisely and you pick partners that are willing to upskill the workers on their platform, that are willing to give them loans to progress their businesses and really help them develop and provide better access to markets so that they can grow those businesses, then there's the potential to have a positive development impact. And I think navigating that balance between those two, this sector is growing. It's growing rapidly, whether we like it or not. And navigating that, I think, is going to be one of the big questions for DFIs in terms of how they improve livelihoods in the informal sector, in addition to the role that they've always traditionally played in the formal sector. Okay,
thank you. Carlos?
Yeah, I agree with that point. I think it's a very important debate that we need to have, and of course there's different views on this. But I think the issue of scaling up and promoting businesses that are more likely to generate stable and less vulnerable jobs is absolutely fundamental. Then going back to one of the questions that you relate to us, Dirk, on the need to coordinate with local actors and governments, I think this is also crucial. because there are places, there are countries where you have quite active governments, and I'm thinking of Ethiopia and their response to the crisis in the first 3-4 months. And it strikes me, to what extent DFIs and other international organizations aligned or did not align to what the government was proposing as a way of overcoming the crisis in the short to medium term. So I think it's when the ideas are there and governments are proposing ways of tackling the crisis, I think it's important for DFIs and other institutions to join forces and really support those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yeah, my final word is that the DFIs should be willing to take more risk. I think that issue has emerged from this panel. And so the shareholders need to put more money in the DFIs, and we need to be more innovative in some of the risk sharing schemes that needs to be put in place moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think this was a really excellent panel on DFIs and job protection. Sort of what I take from this, first of all, that there are huge opportunities for DFIs to play a role, and I think that is something we need to take on board. That DFIs have a strong role. They can fill gaps, and they have also, secondly, already done a lot of things, and they already have been doing things before the crisis, as it were. But now they've stepped up their support during the crisis. And we've heard some examples here of what they've been doing, which is also very, very good to see. But we've also heard that they can do more. And I think the DFI representative, so Julian, for example, is also suggesting we need to do more homework. And in the future, we can think more about dealing with informality. We can need to think about digitalization. So there are a range of issues that need to be looked at, and we may need to be even better prepared than we were before. And perhaps also the importance of taking risks. And of course, we'll see how it goes this year, and whether investee companies, of course, are at risk. But I think a call for more risk taking, I think, is also well taken from Stephen. So lots of opportunities. DFI is doing a lot already, and more can be done, I think, is our takeaways. So with that, I'd like to thank the audience for their questions, but of course the panel, Sam, Carlos, Julian, and Stephen, for their insights, and thank you very much also for the collaboration with the range of DFIs. And I hope everyone who's watching this will also sign up for the next meeting, which is on the development finance institutions and the health sector, which is promising to be a very interesting meeting indeed. So we're hoping to see you again then. So thank you very much for tuning in, and hope to see you again. Thank you very much.